Welcome, everyone. We have a highly targeted mission today.
We really do. It's a fun one.
Yeah, so if you are tuning in, consider this your custom-tailored deep dive into a very specific, incredibly dynamic window of human development. We are talking about middle childhood.
Right.
We are unpacking a massive stack of notes, research, and clinical data focused entirely on those years between ages 6 and 11.
And it is a remarkable period of life. I mean, it often gets misunderstood or simply overlooked in favor of the more dramatic toddler years or the teenage years.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone focuses on the terrible twos or the teenage rebellion.
Exactly.
But our goal today is to give you a clear, nuanced synthesis of this vital phase, and we're skipping the dreaded information overload, I promise.
A shortcut to the good stuff.
Right. We are going to explore why kids at this age are basically structurally built like rubber bands.
That's a great way to put it.
We'll unpack the fiercely debated science behind youth sports specialization, and later on we will parse the clinical data to uncover the actual neurobiology of ADHD.
While hopefully putting to rest a few very persistent myths along the way.
Definitely. Particularly the sugar myth.
Yes. But framing this entire conversation really requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Middle childhood is not just a waiting room for puberty.
Right. It's not a holding pattern.
Not at all. It is an era of profound dynamic integration. The physical body and the developing brain are in a continuous bidirectional dialogue.
They're talking to each other.
Exactly. They are constantly rewiring and refining one another based entirely on the child's daily environmental inputs.
Yes.
It is a highly active, high-stakes construction zone.
Okay, let's unpack this, because starting with that physical construction zone, when we look at physical growth between 6 and 11, the trajectory is actually quite slow and steady.
Much slower than infancy, yeah.
Right, compared to that explosive infant growth. Kids are adding roughly 5 to 7 centimeters in height and maybe around 3 kilograms of weight each year.
Which creates that very recognizable, somewhat awkward, long-legged phase.
The classic lanky kid look.
Yeah, simply because the lower body accelerates its growth faster than the upper body right now.
And that steady trajectory also marks the point where we begin to see distinct gender divergences, right, in the growth timelines.
We do. Girls typically initiate their pubertal growth spurt earlier, usually between the ages of 10 and 12.
So, middle school.
Right. And because of that early onset, girls generally end up taller than boys by the close of middle childhood. They also began adding body fat at a faster rate right around age 8.
Well, boys are just waiting.
Yeah, boys generally hold off on their major growth spurt until around age 13.
Which perfectly explains the skewed height dynamics at literally any middle school dance.
Completely.
But looking at the musculoskeletal data, there is a fascinating mechanical reality here. Kids are incredibly flexible right now.
The rubber band effect.
Yes, because their bones are actively lengthening and broadening, but their ligaments aren't firmly attached yet.
They are highly elastic.
And this maps perfectly onto what we call growing pains. When a child complains of leg aches at night, it is simply the muscular system struggling to adapt and stretch to accommodate a rapidly expanding skeletal frame.
It's mechanical stress.
Exactly. Not to mention, this is the era of the tooth fairy. All 20 primary teeth are lost and replaced during this specific window.
All 20. The physical transformation is undeniable. But what's fascinating here is what is happening simultaneously inside the skull.
The brain sculpting.
Yes. The neuroscience of middle childhood demonstrates that brain growth is highly experience dependent. It interacts directly and physically with whatever the child is doing.
So the environment and their daily habits are acting as the actual architects of the neural pathways.
Precisely. The research highlights reading as a prime example here. When a child engages in massive repetition of a complex skill, like reading, say, between kindergarten and the 5th grade, that targeted experience physically alters the brain.
It actually changes the structure.
It results in a net increase of synapses in the specific neural networks supporting phonetic and semantic processing. It visibly thickens the cortex in those areas.
Wow.
The brain reinforces the infrastructure it relies on most.
While simultaneously demolishing the infrastructure it doesn't use.
That is the pruning process.
Right?
Pruning makes the brain substantially more efficient by eliminating redundant or unused synapses. And it operates in tandem with myelination.
The insulation.
Exactly. Myelin is the fatty insulation coating nerve fibers. It dramatically increases the speed and fidelity of neural communication.
Like upgrading to fiber optics.
That's a great analogy. And the elegant part of this biological design is that the regions experiencing the most aggressive pruning are the exact same regions receiving the greatest gains in myelination. The system is ruthlessly optimizing for speed and efficiency.
But that optimization comes with a trade-off, doesn't it?
It does.
As these neural structures become highly dedicated to specific tasks, a process called specialization, the brain gradually sacrifices some of its early plasticity.
Yes, it loses that flexibility.
The sources note that if a child sustains damage to a language center before age 5, their brain is plastic enough to often recover almost full functionality. It just reroutes those tasks.
Right.
But if that same damage occurs in an older child or an adult, the recovery is far less robust. The real estate has already been zoned and built upon.
That is the cost of specialization. However, alongside that specialization, we see a huge surge in integration. The specialized regions dramatically increase their crosstalk.
They start communicating with each other.
Exactly. Returning to the reading example, integration is the mechanism that allows a child to visually process a symbol, seamlessly associate it with a specific phonetic sound, and simultaneously retrieve its conceptual meaning from memory.
And that highly efficient, deeply integrated neural network directly drives what these kids can execute physically.
Yes, they fuel each other.
Because moving into gross motor development, the gains in balance, force, agility, and flexibility are just striking.
They really are.
And when you parse the data on motor performance, the sex differences remain remarkably minimal across most categories, with just a few notable divergences.
The clinical observations show girls tending to maintain their baseline flexibility and demonstrating superior balance overall. Boys, conversely, see their flexibility dip to a developmental low point during this specific window.
But the most glaring statistical gap between the sexes emerges in throwing, the mechanics and the velocity.
The throwing gap is massive.
It really is. At age 6, the disparity is relatively small. Boys average about 35 feet, while girls average around 19 feet.
A 16-foot difference.
Right. But fast forward to age 11, and boys are hitting distances over 100 feet. That's nearly a 70-foot game. Girls at 11 are throwing about 58 feet. A 39-foot game.
But what the sources emphasize is that this isn't purely a biological divergence.
Exactly. We are seeing the compounding impact of social conditioning, differing practice opportunities, and targeted coaching. The biology at this age just doesn't account for a gap of that magnitude without the environmental influence.
That is a crucial distinction. The environment shapes the motor output. But whether a child is throwing a baseball, navigating a balance beam, or just playing tag, that physical activity is performing an essential cognitive function.
The bidirectional link.
Exactly. Physical fitness strongly predicts improved executive function, superior working memory, and higher academic achievement.
Because the fitness is actually altering the brain's structural integrity.
Yes.
The research shows that the physical structures supporting attentional control and memory are measurably larger and more heavily myelinated in physically fit children. Furthermore, their processing speed doubles during this era. A 10-year-old reacts twice as fast as a 5-year-old.
Movement is quite literally constructing the mind.
Which contextualizes why this demographic is so naturally kinetic. Daily activity levels peak between ages 7 and 9. We see roughly 79% of boys and 70% of girls participating in organized sports during these years.
And interestingly, the psychological data indicates their primary motivators are intrinsic. It's about mastery, peer connection, and just having fun.
Not the extrinsic rewards.
Right, not trophies or elite status.
So what does this all mean when we confront the overwhelming pressure for early sports specialization? Because the culture pushes parents to pick one sport for their 7-year-old and just abandon all the others.
The specialization debate is one of the most contentious areas in youth athletics, and the research requires us to look at it impartially.
Okay, let's look at the arguments.
Proponents of early specialization lean heavily on two theoretical frameworks. The first is the 10-year rule.
Right.
This proposes that accumulating 10 years of intense, deliberate practice is the prerequisite for expert-level performance. The second is the power law of practice.
Which means
It dictates that early, deliberate practice yields incredibly rapid progress, giving early specializers a significant, immediate competitive advantage.
But that early advantage seems to come at a steep physiological cost. The data clearly favors diversification in those early years.
It does.
By engaging in multiple sports, children develop a broader, more adaptable motor skill repertoire. And more importantly, the injury data is unequivocal. Diversification drastically reduces the rate of severe overuse injuries.
Because the child isn't subjecting the exact same joints to repetitive stress year-round.
Exactly. It also heavily correlates with a longer-standing interest in athletics, insulating them against the profound burnout we see in early specializers.
The clinical consensus generally points to a pragmatic middle ground here. For the vast majority of sports, specialized training can safely be delayed until a child is 9 or 10 years old.
So wait a bit.
Yes. This delay accommodates critical early diversification, builds foundational athleticism, and you still easily satisfy the 10-year rule by late adolescence.
Around age 18 or 20. Now, there are exceptions, of course. Sports where absolute peak physiological performance occurs in early adolescence.
Gymnastics and figure skating are the primary examples.
Right. They require earlier specialization if elite, Olympic-level competition is the objective. But for a soccer or a baseball player, the early specialization push seems driven more by anxiety than biomechanics.
That aligns perfectly with the data. Now, transitioning from athletic performance to overall physiological resilience, we really need to examine the health hurdles prevalent in our modern environment.
Starting with sensory health. Myopia, or nearsightedness, emerges as the dominant vision issue in middle childhood.
And it's on the rise.
It is. The cause is a blend of heredity and environment, particularly the modern habit of prolonged focus on close proximity stimuli. So for anyone listening, the takeaway here is highly actionable. Kids need screen and book breaks.
The devilling eye requires regular intervals of distant focus.
Exactly. Conversely, auditory issues are relatively rare. Surveys indicate only about 15% of children experience hearing problems, and only 3 to 4% of that is due to ear infections, which naturally decrease in this age bracket.
While auditory issues wane, respiratory conditions are a primary concern. Asthma stands as the most common chronic illness of middle childhood. In Canadian populations, for example, it affects roughly 15% of children between 4 and 11, usually appearing by age 5.
And the data on asthma highlights an undeniable urban divide. While there is a genetic predisposition, the environmental triggers in cities are exacerbating this. Poor air quality, less fresh air, indoor dust mites, fungi, smoke. It creates a hostile environment for developing lungs.
The sources also heavily correlate maternal smoking, particularly during pregnancy, with the initial onset of the condition.
The environment is a powerful catalyst.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, perhaps no environmental factor is more compromised today than sleep architecture.
Oh, the sleep data is wild.
Children in this developmental phase require 9 to 11 hours of sleep per night. Yet population data reveals a staggering deficit across the board.
Many just fall short. And the sleep data is compelling because it maps out the exact metabolic pathway where sleep deprivation triggers childhood obesity.
It's a direct link.
It's not just that tired kids are too lethargic to exercise, or that staying up late means more late-night snacking. The both of those are true.
Right.
The clinical reality is that chronic sleep deprivation fundamentally disrupts the endocrine system. It alters the hormones that regulate satiety and fat storage.
It creates a metabolic environment primed for weight gain, low energy, metabolic issues. And the epidemiological data on obesity is sobering. Current national studies indicate that nearly 1/3 of Canadian 5 to 11-year-olds fall into the overweight or obese categories.
The 85th to 95th percentile, or above the 95th.
Exactly. And the risk factors consistently cluster within low-income demographics, driven by the accessibility of hyperpalatable, high-calorie foods and sedentary lifestyles.
The long-term physiological toll is severe. We're seeing pediatric type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, adult obesity. But the psychological toll is equally devastating. These kids face systemic social exclusion and high rates of clinical depression.
And what the research makes abundantly clear, they have a great breakdown in Table 10.1, is that combating this requires a multifaceted approach. We have to stop viewing childhood obesity as just an individual failing or a parenting deficit.
It is a complete ecosystem failure.
Yes, it requires an ecosystem solution. Parents must offer healthy snacks and limit screens to maybe 2 hours a day. But that effort collapses if schools don't mandate at least 30 minutes of vigorous daily physical activity and completely eradicate junk food.
And it scales up from there. Private industry needs to research better foods and change their advertising practices. Healthcare systems need to track BMI trajectories starting at age 3.
And municipalities must build safe bike routes and environments that facilitate movement. Governments must run media campaigns. It requires every layer of society.
Because currently, the physical environment doesn't just impact their waistlines. It has a profound impact on their psychological resilience. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The mental health pivot.
Exactly. When we pivot to mental health, the data reveals that anxiety disorders are the most prevalent psychological conditions in children. Estimates for kids under 12 range from 3 to 24%.
And the clinical profiles shows 7 distinct types: specific phobias, separation anxiety, social anxiety, selective mutism, panic disorder, agoraphobia, and generalized anxiety disorder.
And they highly co-occur.
They do. The causes are a classic intersection of genetics and environment. Genetically, there's a temperamental predisposition called behavioral inhibition.
Basically, a hypersensitive threat detection system.
Right, but the environment can trigger it. Observational learning is powerful. Children modeling anxious parent reactions, or the complex dynamic of overprotective parenting. Does the overprotection cause the anxiety, or is it a response to an anxious child?
It's usually a reciprocal loop, but the encouraging part of the research is the efficacy of the interventions. Cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, shows exceptional outcomes. By teaching psychoeducation, affect recognition, and systematic exposure to triggers, the results are robust.
Do 55 to 60% of children recover with CBT compared to just 30% without it?
It gives them the cognitive tools to override their nervous systems, which is a perfect segue into another condition deeply rooted in the nervous system: ADHD.
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Usually diagnosed between ages 3 and 6, it affects roughly 2% of the school-age population, with a striking gender disparity. Diagnoses in boys outnumber girls 3 to 1.
And the symptoms center on inattention, careless mistakes, and overactivity or impulsivity, acting before thinking.
But to truly understand ADHD, we have to look at the neuroanatomy. ADHD represents a fundamental delay or physical deficit in the brain's executive function network. MRI data confirms that specific regions in the prefrontal cortex are measurably smaller or less functional in kids with ADHD.
It's highly genetic, rooted in DNA errors, though environmental factors like prenatal alcohol, smoking, or lead exposure also play a huge role.
But looking at the environment brings me to a crucial point. We have to unequivocally bust a very persistent cultural myth. The assertion that ADHD is caused by eating too much sugar or artificial food dies.
The science simply does not support that.
It doesn't. There is a tiny amount of inconclusive evidence that certain dyes may slightly increase symptoms in children who are already diagnosed with ADHD.
Right, a slight exacerbation.
But they absolutely do not cause the onset of the disorder. So if dietary restriction isn't the primary lever, we look at the treatments, stimulants, and behavioral management. And at first glance, giving a hyperactive child a stimulant sounds completely counterintuitive.
It does. But the stimulant isn't acting as a global excitant. It stimulates the specific underactive regions of the prefrontal cortex. It effectively wakes up the brain's braking system, empowering it to inhibit impulsive behavior.
It stimulates the inhibitors, but the long-term data on these treatments is incredibly complex.
You're talking about the MTA study, a massive longitudinal analysis of 600 children. In the short term, a combination of medication and behavioral therapy was clearly best.
But then they checked back in 6 to 8 years later and found no significant differences in outcomes among the treatment modalities. The early advantages essentially washed out.
It's a profound finding. It highlights that managing ADHD is a highly fluid, long-term developmental adaptation.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. From lengthening bones and pruning brain synapses to the 10-year sports rule, the deep link between sleep and obesity, and the neurological realities of anxiety and ADHD. In middle childhood, the mind and the body are inextricably linked. Every physical movement builds the brain, and every brain development refines the physical movement.
This raises an important question, something for you to consider as you observe the modern world. Look at the heavily screen-dependent, sedentary, highly structured environments we've built. If a child's brain literally requires vast amounts of physical free play, varied movement, and 11 hours of sleep to physically construct its own executive functioning in gray matter, how might we need to redesign our modern daily routines to stop working against biology and start working with it?
That is the exact kind of question that shifts paradigms. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out those vital aha moments in your own learning journey, and we will catch you next time. So if you hand a 6-year-old a clump of clay, Smash it flat right in front of them and ask if there is less clay now, they will absolutely say yes.
Oh, yeah. Every single time.
But you hand that exact same clay to an 8-year-old and they look at you like you're an idiot.
Right, like you're trying to pull a really bad trick on them.
Exactly. And in just those 24 months, their brain undergoes this biological rewiring that is so extreme, it's almost like you're dealing with a different species.
Well, you are literally watching the fundamental architecture of a human mind being built from the ground up. It is not just about, getting taller or losing baby teeth. The invisible machinery is being entirely swapped out.
Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. Today, we are digging through a massive stack of developmental psychology texts, behavioral charts, and brain scans, all focused on middle childhood.
Which covers those really critical years from age 6 to 11.
Right. And for our mission today, we are going completely under the hood. Picture a visual of morphing functional MRI scans layered over those classic wooden building blocks. That is the exact backdrop for what we are doing.
It's the perfect way to ground the science. We are blending the biology of a growing brain with the physical reality of how kids play and learn.
We are going to decode this massive cognitive upgrade, exploring how we actually learn to think, how we hijack our own visual cortex to read, and ultimately we are going to ask what intelligence really means.
So if we start with the most obvious question,
Oh.
how does a kindergartner's thinking differ from a fifth grader's? We all know the classic textbook answer here.
Right, Jean Piaget's concrete operational stage.
Exactly. It's that era, typically ages 7 to 11, where kids finally ditch that early childhood egocentrism. They start using actual mental operations and logical reasoning.
And we see it in their sudden ability to handle things like seriation, which is efficiently arranging a scattered pile of sticks from shortest to longest. And they can do it by age 6 or 7 without losing their mind if you hand them a new stick midway through.
They also master transitive inference. That's the whole, if stick A is longer than stick B and B is longer than C, then A must be longer than C logic.
Okay, let's unpack this, though, because it is fascinating. To an observer, it's like their brain just downloaded a new operating system that finally understands logic. But
Yeah.
there is a glitch, right? It only works with tangible objects.
Yeah, that is the catch.
Why is it that a 7-year-old can absolutely crush complex spatial stick puzzles, but if you give them basic abstract algebra, their whole system just crashes?
Because their understanding is strictly grounded in reality. They have to physically see or vividly imagine the physical materials.
Oh.
The sources highlight this beautiful example that exposes the exact boundary of this concrete logic.
Oh, the Ziggy the cat thing.
Yes. So give a child in this window the premise, Ziggy is a cat. All cats bark. Does Ziggy bark?
And an adult easily suspends reality to follow the abstract rule. Obviously, for the puzzle, Ziggy barks.
Right, but the concrete operational child protests. They completely reject the premise because they know cats meow.
They just can't get past it.
I can't. They cannot decouple the logical operation from the concrete reality they live in. The rule violates their physical understanding of the world, so the logic just fails.
But the traditional Piagetian view frames this as a sudden, magical stage leap. Like you turn 7 and boom, you have concrete logic.
Which is such a misconception. What's fascinating here is that modern research shows this shift isn't a sudden leap at all.
Right, the Tomlinson-Kesey longitudinal graph in our stack completely shatters that whole idea.
Exactly. That graph tracked the exact same children from the end of kindergarten through the end of 3rd grade. They repeatedly tested them on conservation tasks.
Like the clay example we started with. Or understanding that pouring water into a taller glass doesn't mean there's magically more water.
Yes. And the mastery lines on that graph do not shoot straight up like a software update. They are incredibly gradual slopes. At the end of kindergarten, 0% of the kids understood the conservation of volume.
Wow, 0.
0. And by the end of 3rd grade, that number was still only hovering around 70%.
Which proves mastery is heavily dependent on context and practice. The texts even point out that in village societies without formal schooling, basic conservation skills are frequently delayed until age 11 or even later.
Because it is not a spontaneous biological timer going off in the brain. It is a response to specific environmental demands.
So if you aren't forced to manipulate numbers or justify logical rules in a classroom, your brain just doesn't prioritize building those specific neural pathways.
Precisely. Which brings us to a huge question about the biological hardware itself.
Right. If this cognitive leap isn't magic, but rather this slow, context-dependent grind, what is actually happening physically inside the brain? How does an 8-year-old suddenly hold 3 different stick lengths in their mind simultaneously?
Cognitive neuroscientists approach this through the information processing perspective. During middle childhood, there are two massive biological renovations accelerating under the hood.
Myelination and synaptic pruning.
Exactly. Myelination is the process of coating neural pathways with a fatty substance called myelin. Think of it like wrapping electrical tape around a frayed wire.
It stops signal leakage.
Right, and makes the electrical impulses travel exponentially faster.
So while myelination is speeding up the signals, the pruning is actively destroying the roads less traveled.
Ruthlessly destroying them. The brain eliminates unused synaptic connections to make the frequently used pathways hyper-efficient.
Just clearing the brush.
Yeah, and this dual process leads to vastly improved selective attention. That is the ability to tune out a noisy classroom, and executive attention, which lets them flexibly shift between tasks.
But the crown jewel of this whole biological upgrade is the expansion of working memory.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's make that concrete for the listener. Think of working memory as a mental workbench. It is the temporary space where you place information you are actively manipulating right now. And as a child grows, that physical workbench literally gets wider.
We use Baddeley's model of memory as a schematic for this workbench. It is run by a central executive that coordinates different temporary buffers.
Like the visuospatial sketchpad for holding images, right?
Yes, and an episodic buffer for integrating timelines, plus a phonological loop for holding sounds.
Okay, so what does this all mean for a kid who is just trying to remember their spelling words?
Well, as that central executive matures, which is heavily driven by genetics and that myelination we just discussed, kids develop deliberate software strategies to maximize their new, wider workbench.
The timeline for these software strategies is so interesting. Around age 7 or 8, they install rehearsal, which is just the raw, brute force repetition of information.
It is the most primitive tool, but it works. It keeps the phonological loop active.
Then comes organization, where they realize, hey, I can group related items together to save space.
But elaboration is where the real magic happens at the end of middle childhood.
That's when they start embellishing information, right?
Yes. Instead of just repeating a grocery list of apples, bread, and milk, they create a bizarre mental image, like an apple eating bread while swimming in milk.
Which forces it to be memorable.
Exactly. Elaboration is highly sophisticated because it physically connects new, fragile information sitting on the workbench to robust, existing knowledge deeply embedded in long-term memory.
But to use any of these strategies effectively, the child has to overcome a major hurdle: metacognition.
Thinking about their own thinking. Developing meta-memory means understanding your own system's limitations.
Right, like an elementary school kid usually knows what they don't know. Ask an 8-year-old if they know their spelling words, and they can accurately tell you no.
But knowing the workbench is empty doesn't mean you have the cognitive self-regulation to actually fill it.
That is the critical gap. Cognitive self-regulation is the ability to monitor progress, evaluate the outcome, and redirect effort if the current strategy is failing.
A child might know they don't know the words, but their only strategy is to just stare at the paper harder, hoping the ink magically absorbs into their retinas.
Which is why our sources scream that teachers and parents cannot just tell kids to study. You have to explicitly teach the software strategies, rehearsal, organization, elaboration, and explain why they work.
You have to teach them how to use their own brain.
But knowing how to use that mental workbench is one thing. What happens when we force this brain into a classroom setting to learn entirely unnatural skills, like reading?
Oh, reading entirely breaks the system. We did not evolve to read printed text.
We literally have to violently hijack existing visual and language circuits to make it happen. And the sheer volume of growth here is staggering. The texts note that a child's receptive vocabulary explodes from roughly 14,000 words at age 6
to an estimated 40,000 words by age 11.
Wait, that is an acquisition rate of over a dozen new words every single day for 5 years. That's unbelievable.
It's massive, and it perfectly aligns with Gene Shell's stage 3 of reading development. Up until about 3rd grade, kids are learning to read. Their working memory workbench is completely overflowing, just trying to decode arbitrary visual symbols into phonetic sounds.
But around 4th grade, there's a fundamental flip.
Right. The decoding pathways become highly myelinated and automatic. That frees up the workbench space, allowing the central executive to finally focus on comprehending the actual meaning of the text.
They transition from learning to read to reading to learn, which is the exact battleground for the reading wars we always hear about.
The whole language versus phonics debate.
Right. Whole language argues kids learn to read naturally through exposure to rich literature, while the phonics camp demands rigorous drilling of letter sound rules. Where do the researchers land?
The scientific consensus overwhelmingly supports a balanced approach. You fundamentally need phonics to build those automatic decoding pathways, but you need the whole language exposure to build the semantic comprehension framework.
You can't have reading comprehension if you can't decode the words, and decoding is useless if you don't understand the concepts.
Exactly. They rely on each other.
Here is where it gets really interesting, though. What happens when this highly complex system hits a snag? We are talking about learning disabilities, which affect 3 to 10% of kids.
Right. And if we isolate developmental dyslexia, which accounts for 80% of all learning disabilities, we have to clear up a huge societal misconception.
The idea that it's a visual thing.
Yes. When people hear dyslexia, they assume it's a visual defect. Kids seeing letters backwards or words dancing on the page.
But the research is definitive. The core issue isn't visual at all. It is a phonological processing deficit.
It is an inability to smoothly segment spoken words into their underlying constituent phonemes, the individual units of sound. If your brain struggles to map a specific sound to a specific letter, the entire decoding process collapses.
The specific spelling errors provided in the text are fascinating because they prove this isn't just random guessing. Once you understand the phonological deficit, the errors make perfect mechanical sense.
They really do.
Take word elongation. A kid spells executive as execcutive. They are overcompensating because they can't isolate the exact sounds. Or homophonic confusion, writing weather like a rainstorm instead of weather like a choice.
But the most revealing one from the source is spelling asleep as asleap.
That is a flawless phonics error.
It is. The child knows EA makes the E sound, like in the word leap. They're applying a perfectly valid phonological rule, but their system is failing to retrieve the correct orthographic code, the specific rote visual spelling from their long-term memory.
And we have to stress, this isn't a motivational issue. The twin studies in our stack show dyslexia has a heritability rate of 0.70. It is deeply wired into the hardware.
Brain imaging shows atypical activation in specific left hemisphere regions, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the angular gyrus,
which are the exact regions responsible for mapping visual symbols to phonetic sounds.
Because it's a hardware issue, the intervention has to be intense to literally force the brain to build new pathways. The data shows it takes 80 to 100 hours of highly targeted, structured intervention over 20 weeks just to meaningfully improve phonological awareness.
And without that intense intervention, you aren't just looking at a kid who reads slowly. The secondary behavioral problems are severe. Subjecting a child to an environment where their brain is biologically failing at a task 8 hours a day, every single day, well, it destroys their self-esteem.
It leads to extreme acting out or complete withdrawal,
which naturally forces us to look at how we measure a child's overall cognitive engine in the first place. We've seen how kids learn specific academic skills, but how do we measure their overall cognitive capacity? This brings us to the very controversial world of IQ.
The standard metric for school-aged kids is the WISCV, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the Stanford Binet.
Right. They measure a general underlying intelligence factor, breaking it down into components like fluid reasoning, visual processing, and our old friend, working memory.
And we plot these on a normal distribution curve with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15.
We know the extremes of the curve. You have intellectual disability, a score of 70 or below with adaptive functioning deficits. In about 25% of cases, this is tied to known genetic syndromes, though 50% of the time the cause is unknown.
And on the other end, intellectual giftedness, scores of 130 or higher, which is about 6 to 10% of the population. These kids desperately need academic enrichment and acceleration to prevent severe boredom.
So here's a question for you, the listener. Is an IQ score basically a permanent biological speedometer capped at the factory? Or can you upgrade the engine?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to unpack the complex formula of intelligence. It is generally accepted as roughly 50% heritable. That is your genetic baseline.
Okay, what about the other half?
25% is shared environment, the things siblings experience together, like household income. And the final 25% is non-shared environment, unique peer groups, individual teachers, or specific illnesses.
But does that 50% environmental input actually allow us to overclock the system?
The research strongly suggests yes. The Diam adoption study is a cornerstone piece of evidence here.
Walk us through that one.
Researchers tracked children with lower initial IQ scores, measured between ages 3 and 5. These children were then adopted into families across a spectrum of socioeconomic statuses.
What specifically about a high socioeconomic status environment changes the brain?
It's a compound effect of cognitive nourishment. It is richer vocabulary exposure, better nutrition, access to educational resources, and critically, lower ambient cortisol levels from reduced financial stress in the home.
Ah, the stress factor.
Exactly. When these adopted children were retested in adolescence, all of them showed some improvement. But the children adopted into high SES families saw massive, statistically significant jumps in their IQ scores compared to those in low SES environments.
So the environment literally pulled their cognitive capacity upward. But let me play devil's advocate here with the reverse scenario. The Samaroff study tracked WISCR scores against the number of multiple environmental risk factors.
Right. Things like severe maternal stress, chronic poverty, or neglect.
And as the number of risk factors increased from 0 to 6, the average IQ scores absolutely plummeted. So my question is, are we measuring a broken engine, or are we just measuring a distracted driver? Does the stress actually lower their raw cognitive capacity, or does it just make them bad test takers on that specific day?
It is both. And that is what makes it so insidious. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, which physically impairs the prefrontal cortex, the exact area responsible for executive function and working memory.
So that mental workbench we talked about actually shrinks under chronic stress.
Yes, they perform poorly on the test because their working memory is compromised in the moment. But over years, that chronic suppression alters the developmental trajectory of the brain itself.
Wow. Since environmental risk factors and the specific demands of a classroom can artificially depress an IQ score, does the standard IQ test actually capture what it means to be smart?
We have to look at what the test was designed to do. IQ tests were created in the early 20th century as an academic early warning system. They were strictly designed to identify children who are at risk of failing in a traditional formal school setting.
They heavily index verbal abilities, mathematical reasoning, and memory. But leaving out everything else means we are missing the full picture of a child's potential.
Right, they completely miss creativity and social understanding.
Our sources point out a glaring mathematical flaw in worshiping the IQ score. The correlation coefficient between an IQ score and actual academic achievement is only about 0.50 to 0.60.
Which means IQ leaves 64 to 75% of a child's academic performance completely unexplained.
That is a massive blind spot.
It is. This is exactly why alternative frameworks are so vital to give you a broader perspective. Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory argued that there are at least 8 distinct kinds of intelligence.
Okay, linguistic and logico-mathematical are there, obviously.
Yes, but he also included bodily kinesthetic intelligence for athletes and surgeons, naturalistic intelligence, and crucial social processors like interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence.
I love that. And then there is Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory, which breaks it down into 3 practical domains. You have analytic intelligence, which is your standard IQ information processing. You have creative intelligence, the ability to generate entirely novel solutions, and practical intelligence, which is basically street smarts.
And practical intelligence looks very different in the brain compared to analytic. Analytic intelligence is solving a well-defined math equation with a single right answer. Practical intelligence is recognizing that the math equation you've been given isn't actually the problem that needs solving.
It is the ability to read a room, adapt to shifting social dynamics, or manipulate an environment to achieve a goal.
But standardized tests actively ignore and sometimes punish practical and creative intelligence because they are inherently messy to grade.
So bringing all of this together, we can see that the journey of middle childhood is profoundly complex. We have seen the brain transition from needing tangible blocks to logically sort the world to a system capable of managing a massive mental workbench.
We watched how forced environmental demands, like reading, can hijack the brain's hardware, and how a phonological glitch like dyslexia can derail that entire process.
And most importantly, we have seen that intelligence is not a rigid factory setting. It is a highly malleable processor that is deeply dependent on the interplay of genetics and environment to reach its full potential.
It is a testament to neuroplasticity. And I want to leave you with one final thought from the sources that perfectly encapsulates just how responsive the brain is.
Let's hear it.
Researchers ran a study using a simple, highly targeted video game program designed to tax working memory. After just 8 weeks of training, the children didn't just get better at the game. Their underlying working memory capacity expanded, their real-world math and spelling achievement improved, and their actual standardized IQ scores measurably increased.
Wait, really? Just from an 8-week video game?
Yes, 8 weeks of targeted environmental input literally upgraded their cognitive hardware.
Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought for you to mull over. If intelligence isn't a permanent biological speed limit, but rather a reflection of the environmental inputs and training we are exposed to,
What dormant, completely untapped intelligences might be sitting inside your adult brain right now, just waiting for the right experience to unlock them?
welcome in. We are so glad you are here today. We're setting out on a brand new deep dive.
We really are.
And we have custom curated this one specifically for you, the learner. We know you're always looking for those aha moments,
Oh, yeah.
those little shortcuts to being, truly well-informed without getting bogged down in all the academic weeds.
Right, getting straight to the good stuff.
Exactly. And today's topic is an absolute gold mine for that. We are exploring the fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes completely chaotic psychological world of middle childhood.
Chaotic is definitely the right word for it.
It really is. We are talking about that critical window, roughly ages 5 to 11.
And it really is a highly dynamic period. We're drawing from a very comprehensive source text today. It's a detailed chapter focused entirely on the emotional and social development that happens during these specific years.
Right.
And what's fascinating here is how rapidly the brain's hardware is upgrading. At the exact same time, their social world is just completely expanding. It's a perfect storm of development.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. Because I know what some of you might be thinking. You're sitting there going, I don't have kids. Why should I care?
Yeah, that's a common reaction.
But do not tune out. This deep dive is essentially a master key to human behavior.
It really is the foundation.
Unpacking the intense social, emotional, and psychological shifts that happen right here in this specific age bracket, it gives us the root source code for adults. It explains your workplace dynamics, your romantic relationships.
Even your own internal monologue.
Yes, exactly. So, to start, we have to look at the awakening of the inner critic, or what psychologists call self-concept and self-esteem.
Right. And to really frame this, we look at Erickson's stages of psychosocial development.
Okay.
Middle childhood is stage 4, which he defined as industry versus inferiority.
Industry versus inferiority.
Exactly. This is the exact era where social comparison truly comes online. Before this age, little kids they're relatively self-contained in how they view their abilities.
Like, if they draw a messy dog, they think they are Picasso.
Exactly. They think it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
But suddenly, around age 6 or 7, they're looking left and right. They're focusing on developing a sense of competence by learning new skills. And if they succeed, they feel pride. That's the sense of industry.
But what if they feel like they're failing? Like, compared to the kid at the next desk who is suddenly reading chapter books while they are still sounding out words?
Then it leads to a profound sense of inadequacy. And that's the inferiority part. It breeds low self-esteem and poor motivation.
Wow.
They're constantly evaluating themselves against their peers now, and their understanding of who they are fractures into a much more complicated picture.
I was actually reading one of the case studies in the text, and this 8-year-old was basically giving a highly nuanced performance review of themselves.
Oh, the self-evaluations are wild at this age.
They really are. This kid was saying things like, well, I'm pretty popular, but I'm definitely not with the super popular kids. And I'm really smart in language arts, but I feel pretty dumb in math, especially when I see what the other kids are getting on their tests. It is wild to hear that level of situational awareness from a 3rd grader.
It is revealing, isn't it? You hear the nuance in that quote. They aren't just universally good or bad anymore. Their self-concept is highly fragmented.
Right.
It can change incredibly quickly depending on the social context, like whether they are sitting in a classroom or out on the soccer field or just hanging out in the neighborhood.
So they're hyper aware of where they stand everywhere?
Exactly. This improved perspective taking means they evaluate themselves on very distinct dimensions.
Which brings us to the actual pillars of self-esteem. The data shows that by ages 6 to 7, kids develop an overall global self-esteem that rests on 5 distinct categories.
Mm,
And those are academic competence, physical appearance, social competence, athletic competence, and behavioral conduct.
right.
And a child can rate themselves incredibly high in one and totally tank in another.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, there's a very surprising detail in the research here.
Okay, lay it on me.
When you look across all of childhood and adolescence, which of those 5 categories do you think has the absolute strongest correlation to their overall global self-esteem?
Honestly, I would have assumed academics. Or maybe making friends would be the priority at that age.
You would think so, but the data is completely clear. It's physical appearance.
Wait, really? Even at 6 or 7 years old?
Yes.
I mean, how are they even internalizing that so early?
It's a stark reality of social conditioning. Physical appearance self-evaluations are the strongest predictor of global self-esteem, even for young children.
That is heavy.
It is. Furthermore, we see that general self-esteem actually takes a hit and declines early in middle childhood.
Because they enter school and start comparing themselves.
Exactly. They compare themselves to a larger group, and reality bites. Now, it does rise later on and remains high for most, but it becomes much more realistic.
And the research also notes some clear gender differences starting right here, doesn't it?
Yes, unfortunately.
Girls typically report lower self-esteem than boys in middle childhood and adolescence, and the data points out this is heavily influenced by differences in sports participation and, again, physical appearance.
Right. It really sets the stage for how we view our abilities moving forward.
So what does this all mean for how they, and eventually we as adults, handle achievement?
That leads us right into the concept of achievement orientation. This is how kids answer the question, why did I succeed or why did I fail?
Okay.
Do they blame their ability, their effort, or just the difficulty of the task? This is where the distinction between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset becomes absolutely critical.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you, the learner. Think about how this applies to us now, because this applies to boardrooms just as much as classrooms.
Absolutely. A child or an adult with a growth mindset attributes their success to ability, but crucially, they attribute failure to either a lack of effort or the difficulty of the task.
So they fundamentally believe they can improve.
Yes. And because of that belief, they take on more challenging tasks, they persist through frustration, and they actively seek out feedback.
Whereas the fixed mindset is basically a massive trap.
With a fixed mindset, success is attributed to external factors like luck, and failure is attributed to a fundamental lack of ability.
Oh, wow.
It's devastating because it leads to learned helplessness. I mean, why try if you fundamentally believe you just aren't smart enough?
Right.
These children, and later these adults, actively avoid challenging tasks because failure is viewed as a permanent indictment of their core identity.
And here is the direct lesson for us. The praise trap.
The praise trap is so real.
The adults in a child's life have a massive influence on which mindset takes root. We might think we're being incredibly supportive by using person praise, telling a kid, wow, you're so smart, or you're a natural at this.
But the research explicitly warns against doing that.
Right. If your boss says you're a natural leader, it feels good in the moment, but it's dangerous.
Exactly. Because person praise emphasizes unchangeable traits. If you are successful because you are inherently so smart, what are you when you inevitably struggle with a hard math problem or a complex project at work?
You must be dumb.
Precisely. You become the opposite. Instead, the research strongly advocates for process praise.
Process praise.
Yes, this emphasizes behavior, strategy, and effort. Saying things like, you worked really hard on that and figured out a great strategy. It reinforces that success is a process, not an innate static quality.
It's all about rewarding the effort.
Yeah.
And the text also needs some interesting cultural context here, which I found fascinating.
Oh, the cultural differences are very telling.
Asian parents and teachers tend to heavily emphasize effort, and they actually analyze failure as a necessary tool for growth. In contrast, American culture places a much heavier emphasis on celebrating success for the purpose of self-enhancement.
It's a completely different approach.
It really makes you think about how these different cultural approaches shape the modern global workplace we all navigate today.
That perfectly sets up another fascinating cognitive leap during these years. To really understand why they care so much about what others think and how they process feedback, we have to look at how their brains are physically upgrading to understand other people's minds.
Okay.
Around ages 10 to 12, children develop what psychologists call Second-order false belief reasoning.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is a massive wall of jargon.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
Second-order false belief reasoning. What does that actually look like in practice?
Let's break it down simply. Imagine Timmy hides a toy under a box.
Okay, Timmy hides a toy.
Sarah comes in and moves the toy to a drawer while Timmy is out of the room. Now, a very young kid thinks Timmy automatically knows where the toy is now just because the young kid knows.
Right, they can't separate their own knowledge from his.
Exactly. But an older child with second-order reasoning can think, I know that Timmy falsely believed the toy is still under the box where he left it. It's the ability to understand that someone holds a false belief, but what another person believes.
Oh, wow. So this is essentially when kids learn to lie effectively.
Yes, or understand sarcasm, or read a room. It requires holding multiple conflicting mental states of different people in your mind all at once.
That's incredible.
It's the absolute foundation for understanding complex social dynamics and office politics later in life.
It's the ultimate brain gymnastics. And as their understanding of others gets more complex, their understanding of society does too.
Definitely.
Looking at the demographic data in the source, we see that racial constancy, that's the understanding that a person's race remains the same across time and superficial changes that develops at about age 6.
Yes.
And right around this time in middle childhood, stereotypes and prejudice unfortunately become much more common.
The research notes that while prejudice may have early evolutionary roots related to in-group survival, it is heavily reinforced by messages from adults and the media.
Right, they just soak it up.
Children are incredibly observant pattern matchers. But this raises an important question. Can it be mitigated?
And the research highlights a specific, highly proven intervention for this, right?
It does. Programs featuring cooperative schoolwork assignments that intentionally mix children from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, sometimes called jigsaw classrooms, alongside training and social perspective taking, have shown immense success at reducing prejudice.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about adult environments. It's like putting together a cross-functional corporate team.
Oh, that's a perfect parallel.
When people from entirely different departments have to work together toward a common goal, the rigid stereotypes about sales versus engineering begin to dissolve because they are relying on each other.
Absolutely. And that cooperative environment heavily influences how they start viewing rules and morality. There's a major shift in how they judge right and wrong in middle childhood.
Right. They start to see the gray areas.
We see a clear distinction form between social conventional rules, which refer to authority, customs, and basic etiquette, like raising your hand to speak, and moral rules, which deal with deep issues of fairness, harm, and individual rights.
The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget theorized that children start out very rigid in their moral thinking early on. A rule is a rule, no exceptions.
Right.
But in middle childhood, they become much more flexible. They start to understand context. They also grapple with concepts like distributive justice.
Distributive justice is a massive milestone. It's the ability to figure out how to fairly distribute rewards.
Like splitting up the loot.
Exactly.
Hmm.
If a group of kids works together to clean up a yard, but one kid worked twice as hard, how do they divide the payment? Do they split it equally, or based on effort, or based on who needs it most?
It's basically an 8-year-old trying to figure out how to divide end-of-year corporate bonuses.
Yeah, exactly.
You can literally see the adult ethical framework being constructed in real time. But of course, all of this social and cognitive development is deeply impacted by what's happening on the home front.
The home base is everything.
How does home life support all this brain upgrading?
Well, it requires a major shift in family dynamics. In middle childhood, kids are spending significantly less time with their parents compared to their early years. The relationship transitions into something called co-regulation.
Co-regulation, I love that term.
It's very descriptive.
It's almost like a manager slowly delegating tasks to a junior employee, right?
Yeah.
The parent and child are actively sharing control over the child's responsibilities.
That's a great way to look at it. The parents act more as gatekeepers and guides. They adjust their responses to the child's evolving personality.
Right.
The child still deeply relies on parents for emotional support and affirmation of self-worth, but the day-to-day management of their life is becoming a joint venture. They're negotiating bedtimes, chores, and homework schedules.
And as they spend less time directly with parents, siblings step into the spotlight.
Oh, yes. Siblings become huge.
I found this fact in the text absolutely hilarious. Toddlers obviously talk more to their mothers, but by age 4, children actually talk more to their older siblings than to their mothers.
It's true. Siblings become vital teachers and playmates.
But middle childhood is also the peak era for sibling rivalry. It is the absolute height of the frenemy dynamic, where they will defend each other fiercely on the playground but tear each other apart in the living room.
That is the classic sibling experience. And we have to look at how these kids navigate major family transitions because the modern family landscape is complex.
Very complex.
The source provides extensive data on the realities of divorce. About 33% of first marriages in North America end in divorce, and ultimately, about half of all children will experience a divorce before they turn 18.
Those are staggering numbers when you step back and look at them.
They really are.
And the impacts on a child's adjustment are incredibly varied. The data shows the transition often brings a sharp drop in family income, especially in mother-headed homes.
Right.
Which isn't just a financial issue. It cascades into moving to new neighborhoods, losing friends, and having to drop out of extracurricular activities.
The research emphasizes that the effects on the child are typically largest in the first year following the divorce.
That makes sense. It's the most chaotic period.
During that initial high-stress period, parenting styles often shift dramatically. Parents might become less affectionate, more punitive, or highly permissive as they deal with their own stress, anxiety, or depression.
Because the parents are just surviving, too.
Exactly. However, the data clearly shows that a return to an authoritative parenting style, which means being warm, but maintaining firm, consistent boundaries, is associated with much more positive outcomes for the kids.
It's also fascinating to see how the psychological impacts differ by gender here. Boys often externalize their distress, so they show higher rates of impulsivity, aggression, and defiance.
Yeah.
They act out.
Yes.
And because this is loud and noticeable, boys often show seemingly poor adjustment to teachers and parents.
Right, because you can't ignore it.
Exactly. Girls, on the other hand, tend to internalize. They experience anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. They quietly retreat, which means their pain can sometimes fly entirely under the radar.
Another critical factor the research points out regarding divorce is custody arrangements. Better adjustment is consistently seen in children who have joint legal custody versus sole legal custody.
And we should clarify what that means for everyone listening.
Yes, please do.
Legal custody refers to decision-making ability over things like schooling, religion, and healthcare. It does not necessarily mean physical living arrangements where the kid splits the week 50-50.
Exactly. When parents share that legal responsibility, it generally indicates lower ongoing conflict between the ex-spouses. And that lower conflict is the ultimate protective factor for the child.
The data also shows the landscape of the modern family is incredibly diverse beyond just divorce.
It is.
In Canada, for instance, over 37% of children live with a single parent. We're also seeing a growing trend of women in their 30s with comfortable incomes proactively choosing to become single mothers.
The text also covers the growing number of children being raised by same-sex couples in North America.
Right.
And the research overwhelmingly indicates that children raised by gay or lesbian parents develop in similar ways to children in heterosexual families in terms of mental health, peer relations, and gender identity.
So the structure itself isn't the deciding factor.
No. Across all these diverse family structures, single parents, blended families, same-sex parents, the quality of the parent-child relationship and the level of conflict in the home remain the primary drivers of a child's adjustment. The structure matters far less than the stability.
Which makes total sense. If the home base is stable, they are infinitely better equipped for what happens outside the home.
Absolutely.
And outside the home is where we find the final and perhaps most intense piece of the puzzle, the social jungle of peers.
It really is a jungle. Middle childhood is the exact moment when true, lasting friendships begin to form.
Yeah.
And the defining feature of these friendships, unlike the simple play-based friendships of toddlers who just happen to be in the same sandbox, is trust.
Trust becomes the currency.
Children now depend on their peers for companionship, emotional support, and approval.
Researchers actually use something called sociometric ratings to assess this hierarchy. They basically go into classrooms and ask kids to confidentially nominate peers they like and peers they dislike.
It's a very raw measure of social acceptance and rejection.
And those ratings reveal a lot about future outcomes. Socially accepted kids tend to be pro-social, low in aggression, and have a good sense of humor.
But there is a very real danger here, known as the developmental cascade of peer rejection.
Developmental cascade.
Yes, if a child shows aggressive, disruptive behavior, or, on the flip side, highly socially anxious and withdrawn behavior, it often leads to peer rejection. And that rejection isn't just a temporary sad event.
Right, it doesn't just stop there.
It operates like a line of dominoes. It cascades into academic failure because they hate being at school. That leads to teacher frustration, which leads to further alienation and later severe internalizing and externalizing problems.
That cascade often intersects with a deeply troubling reality of the schoolyard, which is bullying.
Yes.
The statistics from the source are heavy. Internationally, 4 to 9% of kids frequently engage in bullying, while 9 to 25% are victims.
Those numbers are tough to hear.
For both boys and girls, verbal attacks are the most common form, though the research notes that girls use relational aggression like social exclusion, silent treatments, and rumor spreading much more frequently.
And what's truly unsettling in the data is the role of the bystanders.
Yeah, this part was wild.
While most children report being upset by bullying when asked privately, they rarely side with the victims in the moment. In fact, 20 to 30% of onlookers actively encourage the aggression.
20 to 30%.
Yes, and the bullies themselves aren't always the stereotypical outcasts with low self-worth either.
Right, that's a myth.
They often have average self-esteem and high social competence, but they use bullying strategically to increase or maintain their social status. They simply have different moral standards regarding harm.
And the victims. The text says they're mostly shy, anxious, and already rejected by the peer group. This puts them at severe risk for long-term adjustment problems like chronic loneliness, severe anxiety, and depression. It feels pretty bleak when you look at how ruthless that dynamic can be.
It does sound bleak, but this is where the research offers an incredibly powerful and hopeful takeaway.
Yes, the shield.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Despite all the risks, the developmental cascades, and the aggressive social dynamics, the data shows that having just one close friend acts as an ultimate shield.
Just one friend.
Just one trusted friend powerfully protects a child against victimization and its long-term psychological damage. It completely alters their trajectory and breaks the cascade.
Wow. Just one friend. When you think about it, that is a massive return on investment for human connection.
It truly is.
So let's zoom out and synthesize this entire deep dive. For you, the learner, navigating your own adult world, understanding these middle childhood milestones is literally like reading the source code of the people around you.
That's a great way to put it.
The dramatic shifts in self-esteem based on comparison, the incredible necessity of process praise over person praise to build a resilient growth mindset, the profound impact of peer acceptance. These aren't just phases we outgrow.
No, they stay with us.
They lay the foundational blueprint for the adults we become. How we handle a failed project at work, how we judge others, and how we relate to our own families.
It really is the blueprint, and I want to leave you with a final lingering question that builds directly on the material we just covered.
Go for it.
We saw the undeniable evidence of how having just one close friend acts as a complete shield against the devastating psychological impacts of peer rejection and bullying. But if you look at our modern adult world, with the rise of remote work drastically shrinking our daily social interactions and AI companions beginning to replace casual human banter, are we inadvertently placing ourselves back into that vulnerable, isolated middle childhood state?
Oh, wow.
And if so, how do we actively build that one vital connection to shield ourselves when there's no physical schoolyard left to meet in?
That is a phenomenal question, and definitely something to think about the next time you log on to a remote meeting. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Whether you're prepping for a meeting or trying to catch up on some developmental psychology, or you're just insanely curious about the world around you, you are in the exact right place.
Definitely.
Today's mission is a big one. We are taking a comprehensive, wide-ranging look at the teenage experience. We've got two incredibly detailed source documents in front of us covering adolescent physical and cognitive development.
It is a massive mountain of developmental data.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the ultimate goal here is to decode the teenage brain and body. We're going to uncover exactly why adolescents act, think, and even sleep the way they do.
The plan is to synthesize all of this so you walk away with a crystal clear understanding of what's actually happening under the hood during these formative years.
Right. And whether you're a parent trying to figure out your kid, an educator managing a loud classroom, or just someone trying to make sense of your own past teenage years, this deep dive is going to provide some major aha moments.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we've all lived through it, right? But reading through this research, I realized how little I actually understood about what my own body and brain were doing at the time.
It's wild when you see the actual biological mechanisms laid out.
Yeah. So to kick things off, let's establish a baseline. When we use the word adolescence, what does that actually mean biologically?
Biologically speaking, adolescence is defined as the transitional period between childhood and adulthood.
Okay.
It officially kicks off with puberty. And puberty itself is defined by the biological changes that lead to two very specific outcomes. First, an adult-sized body, and second, sexual maturity.
Right.
So everything we're unpacking today stems from this fundamental, incredibly rapid period of transition.
Well, let's unpack the physical scale of that transition first, because the numbers are just wild. Adolescents gain 40 to 50% of their adult body weight during this window.
Almost half.
Almost half of your adult mass is packed on in just a few short years. What does the actual timeline for that growth spurt look like?
It depends heavily on biological sex. Females usually begin their growth spurt about 2 years earlier than males.
That makes sense.
Yeah, for females, that start time is typically around age 10, and they'll reach their mature physical stature by age 16.
And for males?
For males, the growth spurt usually starts around 12 and a half, with mature stature reached closer to 17 and a half.
What really jumped out at me from our sources was the actual sequence of how that growth happens. I always pictured it as just...
That's a uniform scaling up.
Exactly, like a balloon inflating evenly. But it's not. Growth actually happens from the outside in.
Yes. This sequence completely explains the stereotypical clumsy teenager phase.
It totally does.
The head, hands, and feet grow first.
Which is such a funny image.
It is. Then the arms and legs catch up, and finally the trunk and shoulders grow.
So for a period of time, a teenager is literally walking around with adult-sized hands and feet attached to a much smaller, still-growing frame.
Exactly. And meanwhile, internally, bones are becoming longer and denser, muscle fibers are thickening, and heart and lung capacity are expanding.
Especially in males, the documents noted.
Right, especially males.
So you have this total physical overhaul happening. But it isn't just about the biology of the individual in a vacuum. There's a fascinating historical context here, too. The timeline of puberty has actually shifted significantly over the generations.
Yeah, that's known as the secular trend. The data shows us that in industrialized nations, the average age of menarche,
The first menstruation.
right, the first menstruation for females, it has been steadily decreasing for the last 150 years.
The sources had a really striking graph tracking this.
From the 1840s through the 1960s, across countries like Finland, Norway, Sweden, the UK, and the US, there is a steep, consistent downward line.
I think in the 1840s, the average age in places like Norway was around 17,
And by the 1960s in the US, it had dropped below 13.
a drop of 4 entire years.
Yeah.
What drove that kind of massive biological shift?
The primary driver was environmental, specifically better nutrition and improved healthcare. A body needs a sufficient weight and a specific body-to-fat ratio to trigger the onset of puberty. As industrialized nations improved their food supplies and basic medical care, bodies were able to hit those physical developmental milestones much earlier.
Which makes total sense. If you have the calories, your body can afford to grow.
Exactly. The data indicates that this lower limit seems to have finally been reached, so the age isn't drastically dropping anymore, but it really underscores how profoundly our physical environment shapes our internal biology.
Which brings us to one of the most counterintuitive takeaways in this entire deep dive. We just talked about nutrition, signaling the body that it's safe to grow. But the data also details how the social environment impacts the timing of puberty, specifically for girls.
This is a really fascinating point.
Right. You'd probably assume that a stressful, chaotic home environment would delay physical growth because the body is under strain.
That would be the logical assumption.
But the reality in the sources is the exact opposite. Chronic socio-emotional stress, high levels of family conflict, harsh maternal discipline in early childhood.
And especially father absence.
Yes, father absence or high-conflict father-daughter relationships. These factors are actually linked to the early onset of puberty in girls.
If we look at this through the lens of evolutionary theory, which the source text does, it makes a lot of sense.
Walk us through that.
The evolutionary perspective suggests that if a developing child is in an environment that's stressful or unstable, or where their own long-term life expectancy might be uncertain, the body biologically rushes to mature.
To reproduce early.
Precisely. The underlying biological imperative is to reproduce early if the opportunity presents itself, maximizing the chances of passing on genes before it's too late. It is an ancient, hardwired survival mechanism.
Wow.
Conversely, a lack of stress signals a safe, stable environment. In that scenario, the body can afford to delay puberty, taking more time to build up biological reserves to increase the chances of successful reproduction later down the line.
So what does this actually mean for the teenager living through it?
Yeah.
Because the psychological impact of when you hit puberty is massive.
It dictates so much of their social experience.
And it's vastly different for girls than it is for boys. For girls, the data shows early puberty is consistently associated with negative outcomes. It can trigger what the documents call a developmental cascade.
Right.
We're talking about increased risks of depression, drops in school performance, and negative body image. Plus, maturing earlier physically means they often attract the attention of older males.
Which exposes them to opportunities for risky behavior long before they have the mature impulse control or consequential reasoning skills to actually handle those situations.
Right, because their brain hasn't caught up to their body. But for boys, it's different.
For boys, early maturation is much more of a mixed bag. On the positive side, early maturing boys tend to find more success in athletics. They're often more self-confident, more popular among their peers, and they frequently hold leadership positions.
Because they look older.
Exactly. But it carries disadvantages too. Higher rates of early sexual activity, smoking, drinking, and delinquency.
And what about late onset for boys?
Late onset of puberty for boys is heavily linked to lower self-confidence, an increased risk of anxiety and depression, and lower academic grades.
It's basically a biological lottery that dictates a huge portion of your social standing in middle and high school.
It really is.
Let's shift our focus from the body to the brain now. People usually think of toddlers as having the fastest growing brains. I think the sources said by age 6, a child's brain is already 90% of its adult size and weight.
That's right.
But if the brain is almost fully grown by age 6, what is actually happening during these teenage years?
Massive reorganization.
Okay.
Between the ages of 12 and 18, the brain is essentially rewiring itself. To put it simply, gray matter thins out through a process called synaptic pruning.
Pruning, like with a plant.
Think of it exactly like pruning a messy, overgrown bush so the main branches can grow stronger and more efficient.
Right.
And at the same time, white matter increases through steady myelination. Myelination is basically like taking a bumpy dirt road and paving it into a high-speed neural highway. It allows the brain to process information much, much faster.
And a big part of that superhighway construction is dedicated to the social brain.
Yes.
This is a network connecting subcortical structures, like the amygdala, which processes emotions, to the temporal, parietal, and prefrontal cortexes.
It's a very specific network.
And to show just how sensitive this newly wired social brain is, the research highlights something called the cyberball study.
The cyberball study is incredibly illuminating. Researchers had people of various ages play a simple online game of catch called cyberball.
Just a digital ball being tossed around.
Exactly. But they manipulated the game so that, eventually, the digital players would deliberately exclude the human subject from the game.
They just stop throwing them the ball.
Yes. And if you're listening to this and you've ever rolled your eyes when a teen acted like missing a party or being left off a group chat was the absolute end of the world.
You really need to hear this part.
When 11 to 16-year-olds were excluded from this digital game, they reported much higher levels of depressed mood and anxiety compared to adults who experienced the exact same exclusion.
Wow.
Furthermore, neuroimaging showed that the exclusion activated areas of the social brain network entirely differently in adolescents than it did in adults.
So the takeaway is that adolescent brains are uniquely biologically wired to be hypersensitive to peer inclusion and exclusion.
They aren't just being dramatic. Their brain is literally processing social rejection as a massive, intense threat that adults simply do not feel in the same way.
That's a huge point of empathy. It changes how you look at teenage drama completely.
It does.
And it ties directly into how they make decisions, which brings us to the dual systems model of risky behavior from the sources.
Let's use an analogy here to break that down.
Yeah, think of the teenage brain as a car. The reward network, which involves the limbic system, that's the part of the brain that detects threats and seeks thrills, novelty, and intense stimulation. That network matures very quickly after puberty.
It's a heavy, eager foot slamming down on the gas pedal.
Exactly. But the executive control network, located in the prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, assessing risk, and impulse control, that matures much slower.
Right.
It's still under construction well into the early 20s. So the brakes are faulty, but the gas pedal is fully operational.
And this always raises a big question. Why would human evolution wire the brain to be this reckless?
It seems counterproductive.
It does. We usually view adolescent risk-taking as purely negative, unsafe driving, substance use, and those are very real dangers. But risk-taking is not inherently a bad thing.
How so?
This exact same biological mechanism, the heightened response to rewards combined with an immature fear of consequences, is the engine that pushes teenagers to explore the adult world. It's the push they need to enter a terrifying competition, to risk rejection by starting a new friendship, or to express themselves artistically. If their brains were perfectly risk-averse, they would never leave the safety and comfort of their childhood habits.
They'd never leave the nest.
Exactly.
We see the friction of this biology playing out in the real world every single day, particularly when it comes to sleep. If you have ever tried to drag a teenager out of bed at 7 a.m. for school, the research shows that their refusal to wake up isn't just behavioral rebellion. It is deeply biological.
It comes down to two specific factors altered by puberty. First, their circadian timing system, the brain's internal biological clock, it actually shifts, often becoming less sensitive to morning light.
Okay.
Second, and perhaps more importantly, is the homeostatic drive for sleep.
The homeostatic drive.
This is the biological system that keeps track of how long you've been awake and builds up the pressure to fall asleep. In adolescence, the sleep pressure accumulates much more slowly than it does in younger children.
So they just aren't tired.
Right. The result is that they naturally do not feel tired until much later at night, and consequently, they need to sleep much later into the morning.
But they still need about 9 hours of sleep a night. And because of early school start times, the sources note that more than half of 15 to 17-year-olds are getting 7 hours or less.
The fallout from that is severe.
Excessive daytime sleepiness, reduced executive functioning, and higher risks of obesity and substance abuse. In fact, when schools actually delay their start times to align with adolescent biology, the data associates that change with fewer driving accidents, better academic performance, and lower rates of depression.
It's a very clear example of societal structures actively conflicting with biological reality.
Definitely. And we see similar conflicts when we look at physical health and diet in the sources. More than 2/3 of adolescents exceed the dietary recommendations for saturated fat, sugars, and sodium.
While only 9% meet daily exercise targets.
To give a specific snapshot, in Canada, almost 1/4 of adolescents aged 12 to 17 were classified as overweight or obese in 2014.
If you consider the dual systems model we just discussed, the heavy gas pedal for rewarding, sugary foods, and the immature brakes for portion control, these physical health struggles make a lot of neurological sense.
They really do. And physical health vulnerabilities inevitably intertwine with mental health vulnerabilities. The research dives into the origins of eating disorders, detailing how they stem from both biological and environmental factors. What does the data tell us about the different manifestations here?
The two primary disorders discussed in the texts are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa.
Right.
Anorexia involves extreme eating restriction and an unrealistic fear of gaining weight. It's frequently linked to internal personality traits like perfectionism and setting unrealistically high personal standards.
And environmentally.
Environmentally, it's often associated with mothers who have high expectations for physical appearance and exhibit overprotective or controlling parenting styles.
And what about bulimia?
Bulimia is characterized by binge eating, followed by guilt and purging. This is more often linked to a feeling of a lack of control and is associated with parents who are disengaged or emotionally unavailable.
The mental health statistics overall are sobering. Suicide remains one of the leading causes of death in adolescents worldwide, highly associated with depression. But the research also brings up psychosis, specifically schizophrenia.
Yes. A large proportion of individuals who develop schizophrenia, which affects about 1% of the population, experience their first episode of psychosis under the age of 25.
Because of the rewiring.
Right. The sheer scale of neurological rewiring happening during adolescence makes the brain uniquely vulnerable during this window.
That neurological fragility we see with things like schizophrenia also shows up when teenagers start navigating new, highly charged social and physical milestones,
Right.
like sexual activity.
Yes.
The sources mention that for the majority of Canadian youth, first sexual intercourse occurs between 16 and 18 years of age. But the broader trends are actually shifting. Youth today report having fewer sexual partners than in the 1980s. Condom use has increased significantly, and pregnancy rates have actually been declining since the 1970s.
That is a positive trend.
It is. However, the data highlights some very specific vulnerabilities for minority youth.
The data on sexual minority youth, including LGBTQ plus individuals, reveals disproportionately high rates of psychological distress.
Right. We want to be clear, we're just reporting what's in the source material here.
Exactly. According to the texts, due to verbal harassment, physical attacks by peers, and sometimes rejection by family members, these youth face suicide rates 2 to 3 times higher than their heterosexual peers.
But there is a crucial finding regarding resilience here in the documents.
Yes. The achievement of a positive sexual identity, fully accepting and validating who they are, significantly enhances their ability to withstand and navigate those external stressors.
It all comes back to the immense power of that social brain. Finding belonging and acceptance literally acts as a neurological shield. Now, let's pivot from the social and physical elements to the purely cognitive. Because despite all this emotional volatility we've been talking about, teenagers are actually making massive leaps in logic and reasoning, right?
They are. The psychologist Jean Piaget called this the formal operational stage, which generally begins around age 11.
The formal operational stage.
Right. This is the milestone where teens become capable of hypothetico-deductive reasoning.
That's a mouthful.
It just means they can finally use abstract logic, systematic thinking, and isolate variables to solve complex problems rather than just relying on what they can physically see or touch.
To test this out yourself, try giving this logic puzzle from our research to a young child versus a teenager. The puzzle gives you 2 premises.
Okay.
Premise 1, the chair is larger than the book.
Got it.
Premise 2, the house is larger than the chair.
Right.
Conclusion, the house is larger than the book.
That makes intuitive sense to almost anyone.
Right. But then, given the second version, premise 1, the book is larger than the chair.
Yeah.
Premise 2, the chair is larger than the house. Conclusion, therefore, the book is larger than the house.
To a younger child, that second puzzle makes absolutely no sense. Because in the real world, a book is never larger than a house. They can't get past the physical reality.
But a teenager can.
Right. An adolescent can suspend reality, they can accept the hypothetical premises as rules for a game, and follow the abstract logic to the mathematically correct, albeit totally nonsensical, conclusion.
They've reached adult-like levels of processing speed and working memory.
Exactly.
Which brings up a fascinating paradox. If teenagers have these adult-like cognitive skills, if they can process abstract logic, identify options, and assess risks, why do they still make such notoriously bad choices?
It comes down to the illusion of invulnerability.
The illusion of invulnerability.
Teenagers usually do understand the risks. They might even mathematically overestimate the statistical risk of getting into a car crash or getting caught sneaking out. Yes. But they suffer from a cognitive illusion that they are personally immune to those consequences. It won't happen to them.
Ah, I see.
Plus, looping back to the social brain, they weigh the potential social benefits. Looking cool, impressing a crush, fitting in, much, much higher than any negative physical or legal consequence.
And they simply lack life experience. When faced with a complex situation, they can get completely overwhelmed by the sheer range of options. Sometimes they just resort to habit or take the absolute easiest route, shutting down their shiny new decision-making process entirely.
And if they make a high-risk decision once and happen to get away with it, their lack of long-term experience causes them to recalibrate incorrectly.
Meaning what?
They suddenly rate that dangerous behavior as highly beneficial and extremely low risk.
You see this cognitive development directly impacting how they behave in the classroom, too. When evaluating motivation in school, researchers differentiate between intrinsic motivation, learning simply because you find the topic personally interesting, and extrinsic motivation, which is working just to get a reward or avoid a punishment.
It's the difference between having a mastery goal, where the student genuinely wants to improve their underlying skills, versus a performance goal, where they just want to get an A on the test so they look smart to others.
How do students actually develop those different types of motivation?
The research points to the expectancy value model.
Okay.
This is a developmental progression that actually starts with the parents. Authoritative parenting, which balances high expectations with high warmth and support, is consistently associated with higher school achievement.
Authoritative, not authoritarian.
Correct. The parents' own beliefs about education shape how they interact with their child. That parental behavior then directly shapes the teenager's own motivational beliefs, which ultimately dictates how the teenager behaves academically.
It is a direct cascading chain of influence. So what does this all mean for you listening? We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started with the sheer physical force of puberty, looking at that massive outside-in growth spurt and how historical improvements in nutrition have drastically shifted the timeline of when childhood ends.
We unpacked how the brain's white and gray matter reorganizes, creating a newly sensitive social brain that processes pure exclusion as intense, genuine pain.
We explored the dual systems model, that heavy limbic gas pedal, flooring it before the prefrontal cortex can build reliable brakes. We looked at the biological realities of why teens sleep the way they do, the heavy impact of their environment on their physical and mental health, and the sudden, powerful leaps they make in abstract logic.
It's a lot of change all at once.
It really is. And if there's one major takeaway to hold on to, it's this. The impulsivity, the strange sleep schedules, the intense, sometimes overwhelming focus on peer approval, these aren't character flaws. They aren't just teenagers choosing to be difficult. These are vital evolutionary steps in human biology and brain development.
It really reframes the entire adolescent experience, doesn't it?
Totally.
And it leaves us with something critical to think about as we wrap up. If we now know, biologically and cognitively, that the adolescent brain is uniquely wired to prioritize social rewards over long-term risks, and we know for a fact that their sleep cycles are biologically delayed by the homeostatic drive,
Right?
how drastically would we need to redesign our entire high school education system, our grading structures, and our daily schedules if we actually wanted to align them with human biology rather than fighting against it every single day?
That is a massive structural question and exactly the kind of thing we love uncovering here.
Oh.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the research. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and above all, keep learning. We'll catch you next time. Welcome to the deep dive. We are incredibly excited you're joining us today.
Yeah, it's really great to dive into this material.
Because whether you are, currently raising a teenager or working with them, or maybe you're just trying to understand your own past, how you became the person you are today, our mission today is to decode the why behind teenage behavior.
Right.
We are looking at this massive, just a really fascinating stack of developmental psychology sources today. We've got textbook excerpts, data charts, and we're basically mapping out the emotional and social roller coaster of adolescence.
And it really is a profound period of, well, psychological reconstruction. When you look at the raw data and the behavioral patterns during these years, what stands out immediately is how much heavy lifting is happening beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And this isn't just, a phase of generalized angst. It is a highly structured, absolutely necessary evolution of the human mind.
Okay, let's unpack this because that reconstruction really starts with how teenagers actually view themselves. The way their self-concept evolves from early to late adolescence is a perfect example of that heavy lifting you mentioned.
It is a very distinct cognitive progression. If you observe early adolescence, you'll notice kids often use completely contradictory statements to describe themselves.
Right, like saying two opposite things in the same breath.
Exactly. They might say, I'm super outgoing, but I'm incredibly shy. And they don't even attempt to resolve that conflict. At that stage, they just lack the cognitive architecture to see the contradiction.
But then they hit middle adolescence.
Yes, and that is where those contrasting self-perceptions start to cause severe distress. They feel this intense internal friction because they are suddenly aware of the inconsistencies. But the catch is, they don't yet have the tools to synthesize them.
Which explains so much about that specific age. That friction is why middle adolescents become hyper-focused on their peers. They're basically using their friends as a mirror to figure out which version of themselves is the correct one.
That's the exact mechanism at play. They externalize the conflict because they can't resolve it internally. But the good news is their cognitive abilities eventually do catch up.
Thankfully.
Right. In late adolescence, they develop the capacity for higher-order abstractions. They finally learn to coordinate those contrasting traits into a unified, complex personality.
So they realize they can be outgoing with their close friends, but shy at a large party. And both of those things are valid facets of a single identity.
Precisely. And consequently, their reliance on peer validation drops and their self-esteem naturally begins to rise.
Which brings us to the monumental question of those years, which is, who am I? This is where Erickson's famous concept of identity versus role confusion really comes into focus for us.
Yes, Erikson is foundational here.
He viewed the major task of adolescence as balancing the desire to explore a multitude of different selves with the ultimate pressing need to just pick one.
It's an identity crisis in the truest sense of the word.
Right. You either achieve a cohesive sense of identity, or you remain totally confused about who you are and what your adult role is supposed to be.
And James Murcia expanded on that framework beautifully. He mapped out 4 specific identity statuses based on 2 fundamental processes. Those are exploration and commitment.
So imagine a 2x2 matrix in your head.
Right. On one axis, you have whether or not someone is actively exploring their options. And on the other axis, you have whether or not they've actually committed to a set of values or goals.
Let's walk through that matrix for you guys listening, because the starting points are actually pretty counterintuitive.
What's fascinating here is that most adolescents actually begin in the 2 categories where absolutely no personal exploration is happening.
None at all.
None. First, there's identity diffusion. This is low exploration and low commitment. They aren't looking for a path, and they certainly haven't chosen one. They are essentially just drifting.
And the other one?
The other common starting point is identity foreclosure. That's low exploration, but high commitment. This happens when a teen simply accepts someone else's values, usually their parents, without ever pausing to question or explore them personally.
But I would argue that foreclosure isn't inherently a bad thing, right? Like, what if a teenager adopts their family's values or decides to take over the family business and it actually turns out to be a really great fit? Doesn't that just save them a decade of anxiety?
It can certainly look like a massive success story on the surface, but the developmental risk is that the foundation might be brittle.
Because they didn't build it themselves.
Exactly. Because they bypass the exploration phase, they haven't built the psychological resilience to defend or adapt those values when they inevitably face a major life challenge. It's an identity built on borrowed conviction.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
To build your own conviction, you have to enter the exploration phases. And the one that feels the most chaotic out of the 4 is definitely identity moratorium.
Oh, absolutely.
This is high exploration, but low commitment. It is the classic college experience of changing your major 5 times in 2 years, or joining 3 different activist groups in a single semester. You are trying on all these different hats, aggressively seeing what fits, but refusing to lock anything in.
All with the ultimate goal of reaching identity achievement. That's where you've done the hard work of exploring and you've made a firm personal commitment to your direction.
But the timing of that achievement is where we see a major shift in the current understanding of development. We culturally tend to associate this entire crisis with high school.
We do, but the sources show us that true identity development reaching that achievement phase mostly happens in early adulthood. Specifically during what is now categorized as emerging adulthood, between the ages of 19 and 25.
That is a massive plot twist. We expect 18-year-olds to have it all figured out when they graduate high school, but cognitively, they are literally just getting started.
Because the cognitive requirements for genuine identity achievement are incredibly high, you need advanced hypothetical reasoning. Adolescents are just beginning to develop this.
Right.
It allows them to imagine themselves in complex future roles and actively learn about the possibilities. During the teenage years, the cycle is mostly about breadth. They are scanning a wide horizon of options.
But in early adulthood, it shifts to depth.
Exactly. A 22-year-old can take those hypothetical roles, examine them deeply, and synthesize them into a permanent self-structure.
And it's crucial to note that this search is about far more than just picking a career path. They're establishing their values and personal relationships, defining their sexual orientation, their political beliefs, and importantly, their ethnic and racial identities.
Yes, Jean Finney's work on ethnic racial identity maps very closely to Marce's matrix. She outlines a progression starting from an unexamined identity, moving into an active identity search, and ideally culminating in identity achievement.
And arriving at that achievement is hugely beneficial.
Immensely. Across all demographics. Arriving at a strong, synthesized ethnic racial identity is associated with highly adaptive, positive psychological outcomes. It acts as a profound anchor for the individual.
But once a teenager decides who they are, How do they decide what that person believes is right or wrong?
That is the next big hurdle.
Right, that brings us to the moral compass. To examine this, we have to look at how people process ethical puzzles. Now, we have a question for you, the listener. It's the classic Heinz dilemma from the source material.
A very famous thought experiment.
Yes. So, a woman is near death, there's a cure, but the local druggist is charging 10 times what it costs to make. The desperate husband, Heinz, cannot afford it, so he considers breaking into the store to steal the drug. So should he steal it?
And in developmental psychology, whether you say yes or no is largely irrelevant.
Exactly.
Lawrence Kohlberg used this dilemma to map out 3 distinct levels of moral reasoning, focusing entirely on the logic used to justify the answer. Level 1 is pre-conventional reasoning.
And what does that look like?
At this stage, morality is dictated entirely by external forces, specifically anticipated rewards and punishments.
So an obedience-driven response from someone at this level would be, don't steal it because it's against the law and you'll go to jail.
Yes.
Or a reward-driven response might be, steal it because your wife will be eternally grateful to you. Notice how the logic is entirely self-centered there. It is all about what happens to the person making the decision.
And then we elevate to level 2, which is the conventional level. Here, moral reasoning shifts outward and is determined by society's norms and the expectations of others.
So moving past just pure punishment and reward.
Right. You might argue Heinz should steal the drug because his community will approve of his behavior and see him as a dedicated husband. Or, stepping back to look at the whole social system, he shouldn't steal because no one is above the law and laws exist to maintain order for everyone.
Finally, there's level 3, the post-conventional level. This relies on internal personal moral codes rather than external laws.
It's much more abstract.
Yeah. Someone operating here might argue that Heinz should steal the drug because a human life fundamentally outweighs a property right. The highest stage of this level is based on universal ethical principles like justice, compassion, and equality, even if acting on those principles means directly breaking society's laws.
It's a very elegant progression.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because while Kohlberg's progression sounds incredibly elegant, it has faced massive fundamental criticisms in the literature. It turns out this ladder of moral reasoning isn't quite as universal as he proposed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to critically examine the cultural context. Kohlberg's theory places the highest moral value on individual rights and abstract justice.
Right.
That is a distinctly Western Judeo-Christian perspective on what constitutes good behavior.
Right, but if you look at Eastern cultures, the moral foundation is often entirely different. They frequently prioritize caring for others, community harmony, and familial obligations far above abstract individual rights.
Precisely. So, someone from a culture prioritizing collective care might score lower on Kohlberg's scale, perhaps landing in the conventional level.
Just because they answered differently.
Exactly. But it's not because their moral reasoning is less sophisticated. It's because their cultural definition of a moral imperative is fundamentally different. Kohlberg's scale measures proximity to Western ideals, not necessarily objective moral development.
There's also the reality of social domain theory. Morality isn't a single switch in the brain. The theory separates our decisions into the moral domain, social conventions, and the personal domain.
We constantly shift our reasoning.
Right. We constantly shift our level of reasoning depending on which domain a situation falls into. You might use post-conventional universal ethics when debating human rights, but use basic conventional reasoning when deciding whether to cut in line at the grocery store.
And perhaps the most practical criticism of Kohlberg is the assumption that advanced moral reasoning actually translates into moral behavior. History and psychology show us that this is a deeply flawed assumption.
It doesn't always line up.
Not at all. The ability to articulate a stage 6, universally ethical reason for an action does not guarantee that an individual will actually behave ethically when the pressure is on. Reasoning and action are 2 very different psychological pathways.
So we've mapped out the internal world, the long runway of identity formation, and the cultural nuances of the moral compass. Let's shift our focus to the external world now, the social web.
The everyday reality.
Because the everyday reality of adolescence is defined by the messy, complicated dynamics with parents and peers.
The transition of reliance from the family unit to the peer group is arguably the most visible hallmark of adolescence, and the behavioral data perfectly illustrates just how dramatic this shift is.
There is a metric charting the changes in time spent with family members from 5th to 12th grade. The amount of waking hours spent with extended family and family groups just falls off a cliff. Is an absolute freefall.
They are seeking autonomy. It's structurally very similar to how a toddler suddenly wants to walk away from their parent at the park.
Just testing the distance.
Yeah. Yes, but just like the toddler, the teenager still desperately needs their parents to act as a secure base. They need to know the safety net is there so they can explore the outside world. But the friction between wanting the safety net and wanting to escape it is intense.
It's funny to think about a relationship being measured in conflicts per minute. But that is exactly how researchers tracked mother-child arguments over an 8-year period in the data.
It sounds like a sports statistic.
It does, but it captures that exhausting reality of living with a teenager perfectly.
And that data forms a very distinct U-shaped curve. Around ages 11 to 12, the conflicts per minute are relatively low.
But then it shoots up.
It has a massive peak right around ages 15 to 16. It clocks in at almost 0.9 conflicts per minute during observed interactions. But importantly, it drops right back down to baseline levels by ages 17 to 18.
And it's vital to note that these arguments aren't usually about deep moral failings. They are about everyday frictions. Curfews, chores, the tone of voice being used. And navigating these seemingly petty conflicts is actually what helps teens develop emotional regulation. It is practice for the real world.
But the success of that practice depends entirely on the environment the parents create. In a representative sample of American adolescents reporting on parenting styles, we see some stark divisions.
Right, the numbers here are really telling.
35% report having authoritative parents. These are parents who are highly affectionate and involved. They set clear rules, but they are willing to discuss and explain those rules rather than just enforcing them blindly.
And across the board, children of authoritative parents showed the best outcomes in academic achievement, social skills, and emotional health.
Yes.
But isn't authoritative highly subjective? I mean, what feels like a supportive discussion to one teenager might feel like a suffocating interrogation to another, just depending on their personality.
That is a fair point regarding individual temperament. But in the literature, authoritative refers to a very specific behavioral baseline from the parent. It means high warmth combined with high structure.
The presence of the secure base.
Exactly. The subjective interpretation might vary, but the psychological safety it provides is universal. And we know this because of the stark contrast with the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
An equal 35% of adolescents report their parents are completely disengaged. Low warmth, low structure.
That is a staggering statistic. Over a third of the population is growing up without that secure base. And the outcomes associated with disengaged parenting are severe. High impulsiveness, risky behavior, and delinquency.
Because there's a void.
Yeah, when you create a psychological vacuum like that at home, teenagers will inevitably turn to their peers to fill it.
Exactly. Friends become the ultimate support system. Now, the research does indicate distinct differences in how these friendships function.
Well.
Well, girls' friendships tend to prioritize intimacy and emotional support, whereas boys' friendships often center around shared activities, skill development, and competition. But in both cases, the peer group becomes the primary sounding board for their developing identity.
But relying entirely on a peer group whose brains are also under construction has its pitfalls.
Oh, certainly.
There are two specific concepts here that perfectly capture the dark side of this dynamic. The first is co-rumination. This isn't just venting. This is when friends endlessly rehash an upsetting issue without ever moving toward a solution.
It just spirals.
Yes, picture a group chat where 5 teenagers spend 4 hours overanalyzing a single, slightly ambiguous text message from a classmate. The shared obsession actually amplifies the distress, putting them at significant risk for severe anxiety and depression.
It's a localized echo chamber of anxiety, and the behavioral equivalent of that is deviancy training.
That one sounds intense.
It is. This occurs when antisocial peers increasingly reinforce each other's bad decisions. They actively validate and encourage deviant comments or actions during their interactions.
Like hyping each other up for doing something wrong.
Precisely. We see this amplified dramatically in modern contexts. Think of toxic online gaming lobbies where inflammatory language is cheered on, or social media challenges where dangerous public behavior earns immediate peer validation. They're literally training each other to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior.
And because over 80% of North American adolescents maintain active online profiles, that peer web is inescapable. The physical boundaries of the schoolyard are gone, meaning phenomena like cyberbullying can infiltrate the home, stripping away the one place that is supposed to be a secure base.
The architecture of their social lives is also fundamentally shifting during this window. They start in small, exclusive cliques of maybe 5 to 8 same-sex members. As they mature, these merge into larger reputation-based crowds.
And then the critical milestone,
Yes, a critical milestone occurs when those same-sex cliques begin transitioning into mixed-sex cliques.
which naturally opens the door to romantic relationships. And the numbers here are substantial. By age 16, 55% of boys and 64% of girls report having been in a romantic relationship within the last 18 months.
The developmental timeline split into 3 groups here. There are the early starters, the on-time majority, which makes up about 52%, and the late bloomers.
But the success and health of those early romances are deeply intertwined with everything we've discussed so far. A teenager's working model of attachment, built heavily on whether they had an authoritative or disengaged parent, dictates how they handle vulnerability with a partner.
Their moral reasoning dictates how they treat that partner.
Exactly. It all coalesces in these early romantic interactions.
There is one final, fascinating stabilizing factor we have to discuss from the data: religion.
Right. Involvement in a religious community, which is heavily correlated with having parents who actively attend services and discuss their faith, provides a profound structural advantage during these chaotic years.
The correlation in the data is undeniable. Adolescents and emerging adults who are actively involved in religion show significantly lower levels of internalizing problems like depression and lower externalizing problems like behavioral issues or delinquency.
Plus the positive benefits,
Furthermore, they report greater overall life satisfaction and a stronger sense of purpose.
which makes perfect sense when you map it back to identity and morality. A religious community provides a ready-made framework. It offers a clear set of values to evaluate during that identity search phase we talked about, and it provides a multi-generational social web that extends far beyond the high school peer group.
It acts as an anchor. It doesn't bypass the need for personal exploration, but it provides a very clear, structured environment in which that exploration can safely occur.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from the internal, decade-long process of identity formation and the cultural biases in how we judge moral reasoning, to the external reality of mother-child conflict curves and the intense psychological influence of peer group chats.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But when you step back and look at the aggregate of this research, it fundamentally reframes the teenage experience. Adolescence isn't a disease to be cured. It is a period of building the cognitive architecture required to understand a complex world. They are testing the boundaries of morality and navigating the turbulent but absolutely necessary shift from relying on a family unit to establishing their own independent footprint. So what does this all mean?
It means we need to view these years through the lens of positive youth development. This is a psychological framework that explicitly moves away from trying to fix broken teenagers.
Focusing on the good instead.
Instead, it focuses on identifying and nurturing the positive resources already within them. It's about recognizing their inherent resilience. We know that successful, healthy development routinely occurs despite highly stressful experiences.
Right.
When we understand the underlying mechanics, the identity matrix, the shifts in moral domains, the evolutionary drive for autonomy, we stop fighting the developmental process and start effectively supporting their resilience.
It is an incredibly empowering way to view a phase of life that traditionally gets painted as nothing but a headache.
It completely shifts the paradigm.
Yeah.
And considering James Marcia's matrix of identity exploration and commitment, this raises an important question.
Well, I like where this is going.
We've established that this intense psychological search peaks in our mid-20s. But does that mechanism ever truly shut off? Think about the classic adult midlife crisis.
Wow.
When a 45-year-old suddenly blows up their career, ends a long-term relationship, or drastically alters their lifestyle, are they simply re-entering an identity moratorium phase?
Because the commitments they made at 25 no longer fit.
Exactly. Perhaps the commitments they made back then no longer align with the fully developed person they are at 45. Their brains aren't breaking down. They might just be utilizing those exact same adolescent tools to explore anew because the search for identity is never truly finished.
That is a phenomenal point. It implies that the chaos of adolescence is just the first iteration of a cycle we're destined to repeat whenever we outgrow our current selves. Well, that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you a sharper, more empathetic lens through which to view the teenagers in your world, or perhaps a new understanding of the teenager you once were. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. We will catch you next time.